Well, thank you very much, Dan, and good morning to all of you. It's my job to frame the discussion for the next couple of days. And I'm going to do this by making a presentation which is based on the background paper. And the aim of the presentation is to investigate the degree to which crisis-affected people are involved in humanitarian response and what international actors can do about it. Now, before I get to this, I'd like to tell you a story, and it's a true story from Ethiopia in 1985. So please, if you can, picture the following scene. Imagine a young man with brown hair, that's me, believe it or not, showing a delegation of senior humanitarian officials around a camp in a place called Koran in northern Ethiopia. And there are about 60,000 people in this camp, all of whom are part of a very rich culture, all of whom are experienced in managing different sorts of famine, and all of whom know most about their needs. Now, it's a very hot day, and there are 5 of us in an air-conditioned Land Cruiser. And I suggest that we get out and talk to some of the people living in the camp. But the delegation inside had already spoken with agency staff. It's hot and it's sticky outside, and there's general agreement that there's nothing more to learn. And a decision is made to leave the camp and drive back to the hotel. Now, obviously, this decision is a bad decision, and it's wrong on many levels. More than anything, perhaps, it reflects a culture at the time that did not properly recognise the capacities and skills of local people. And it's not a particularly pleasant memory. And I'm very relieved that the culture that prevailed at that time has changed. But, and here's the thing, how much has it changed, and where are we now? I hope that the purpose of this presentation will help us provide an answer to this question. So, the subject of participation and engagement has its roots in the work of revolutionists like Paulo Freire, but when it was picked up by humanitarians, the emphasis changed from revolution to reorientation. Now, Robert Chambers, who you can see on the panel there, articulated this when he spoke about reversals between the powerful and the powerless in the mid-1990s. And he nuanced his point by saying that reversals should not be taken too far, but what was required was a reorientation that recognised the capacities of people without power. Now, Robert set out that direction 20 years ago, but the evidence suggests that there's still a very long way to go before this destination is reached. And many of you will remember the famous tech recommendation from 2007 that was still calling for a fundamental reorientation of the humanitarian system. And this was after, if you remember, scathing analysis of the agency response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. And more recently, in the last 2 State of the System reports, both warn us that reality still lags well behind the rhetoric. So, although this is a very sobering place to start, it's probably the right place to start. And this meeting gives us all a chance to really understand why the system appears to have made such slow progress, and what we, the community, can do about it. Now, I think the first thing to report in the literature that we found is that several terms related to intentional interactions between agencies and affected people are often used interchangeably. And this, of course, can create confusion. So we have defined 4 distinct terms in the paper. Now, we realise they're not exclusive categories, and they do overlap, and I suppose not everyone in the room will agree with them. But they ought to help us make us be sure that we're talking about the same thing, at least in this meeting. And the 4 terms are engagement, participation, accountability, and two-way communication. And now let me expand. Now, engagement is a general term to cover all instances of people in crisis-affected communities involved in planning and implementing humanitarian response work. This can be work which is designed and implemented by humanitarian organisations or by the community itself. So here we're talking about all kinds of engagement which bring people into contact with a range of actors including government, national, local and international organisations. Next up, participation. This involves crisis-affected people in the planning or implementation of humanitarian efforts in such a way as to give them some power over decisions. An example here may be a village committee that provides inputs on programmes and sometimes leadership. The community here would have some control over the decisions like targeting and some influence over other activities, but the programme is essentially owned by the agency and only to varying degrees by the affected community. I should note that in the literature the term participation is often used more broadly to relate to any activity which involves crisis-affected people in a programme designed by an external organisation. But as I said, our definition hinges on the transfer of power. Next up is accountability, and here we mean approaches to engagement which ensure that external organisations use their power in a responsible way by taking people's views into account and establishing systems that allow people to hold the organisation to account for good quality programmes and for the behaviour of their staff. An example would be a complaints or response mechanisms, which is a key part of the HAPS approach, of course. And here the agency enables affected people to provide feedback on programmes and their views are taken into account. So in this way, they have influence and control over the programme, but the agency really remains mainly in control. So let's be clear here, part of this is about handing over power, but accountability is about being accountable for the power that one has. And last up is communications, which focus on methods for exchanging information between crisis-affected people and external agencies. Communications are an important element of many accountability and participation approaches, of course. So what is important here is that different types of engagement have different aims, ranging from the provision of information to a significant transfer of power. At one end of the arrow that you see on the slide there is simple involvement, such as we see in food for work programmes, for example. And here the agency designs programmes so that affected people take part but have very little control over decisions. The agency clearly owns the programme. If you go to the middle, somewhere around there, we have an accountability approach where the views of the affected community are listened to, but the agency is still very much in the driving seat. And right at the far end of the arrow, we would find some kind of community-based programmes where people engage directly in emergency response. Here the community has control over decisions, while it is the role of the external agency to fund or facilitate the programme. So the next question to get to grips with is about the reasons and motivations for engagement. Now, broadly speaking, the literature identifies three main rationales for engagement with crisis-affected communities. So the first is normative or value-based, and here agencies support engagement because this is the right thing to do. It's consistent with humanitarian values and principles and with the commitments agencies have made. It's also consistent with the religious values of faith-based organisations. The second is of an instrumental nature, and here agencies support engagement because it makes humanitarian programming more efficient, appropriate and effective. In other words, it brings about better humanitarian outcomes. And the third is emancipatory, and here agencies support engagement because it strengthens society and addresses underlying vulnerabilities and or inequalities. Now the important point here is that while most agency or aid providers agree that engagement is a worthwhile goal, that's a given, they're not often clear on why they wish to engage and what they hope to achieve by engaging with crisis-affected people. And here it's also important to acknowledge that there are some critiques out there that challenge the very idea of engagement in the first place, and it's worth mentioning these. So in particular, critics note that in the first phase of a rapid onset emergency, technical and command and control approaches often work better the more consensual, negotiated approaches. And here you see the ALNAP study on leadership, and there's more detail on that. Second one is practicing engagement, and particularly supporting empowerment can make humanitarian organisations into political actors. And this, of course, threatens their ability to remain neutral, impartial and independent. And anyone who has been to an MSF conference will know this only too well. Third, international humanitarian action is marked by huge disparities of power. Engagement approaches may hide this, but they're unlikely to change it and should not pretend that they can. Anyone that remembers the joint evaluation of emergency assistance to Rwanda will take that point. So, there are strong reasons for engaging with affected populations, even though motives are not always clear. But there's also a critique that challenges the very idea of doing it in the first place. But it's also clear that engagement is happening. And so we need to examine the degree to which affected people do currently engage in humanitarian action. So one of the first things that the tech brought out so vividly was that crisis-affected people already act as first responders and undertake relief activities as individuals or through community-based organisations, often independent of government or international humanitarian assistance efforts. And of course, the whole experience of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement is based upon this principle of first response. And international actors have, over the years, recognised the fact and have committed to engaging with crisis-affected people through the many agreed codes, standards and principles that all of us know so well. And related to this, I think, is the fact that we have many examples that date back at least 30 years of humanitarian organisations engaging with crisis-affected people in a variety of ways. But we also know that the evidence base is very thin, and when it comes to understanding if these commitments and examples have actually resulted in bringing about better humanitarian outcomes. So, in spite of the lack of clarity, numerous studies do suggest there is much more than humanitarian organisations could do to engage with crisis-affected people at every stage of the emergency response. So let's quickly just look at the factors that can both promote and inhibit engagement. So the report outlines a variety of factors that may lead to increased popular engagement in humanitarian response in the near future. Better informed populations are increasingly demanding their rights as citizens and redefining their expectations of humanitarian efforts. Improved information technology is enabling crisis-affected people to organise their own responses and communicate needs and opinions more effectively. An increase in the number and capacity of local civil society organisations with an interest in emergency response, and increasingly the role of international agencies may be to support these organisations. There's an increase in cash programme, giving disaster-affected people more control and more options in situations of crisis. And again, we can see the emergence of initiatives like CALP, which aim to support this. There's more remote programming, although this may simultaneously increase the role of local organisations while making the decision-making of international organisations more distant and hard to influence. So let's look at the constraints to engagement. Challenges for humanitarians seeking to engage with crisis-affected populations fall into three main categories: operational contexts, humanitarian staffing, and structures and procedures. First, operational contexts. Let's see, where are we? Yes, we begin with costs here in terms of both time and money. Limited access to communities can make engagements difficult or virtually impossible, and some of you will hear more about these kinds of challenges if you attend the panel on Syria tomorrow. I should say that's a shameless plug for my own panel there, isn't it? I do apologise, I didn't really mean it to go out like that. There's plenty more excellent panels that you can go to. There's limitations on sharing information, and this can bring unwanted attention or put staff and partners at risk, as anyone dealing with the protection agenda knows all too well. And finally, the challenge of replicability. Given there's such a deep cultural element to engagement, what works in one context may not necessarily be replicable elsewhere. In fact, some would argue that every situation needs to be specifically tailored. The second set of constraints relates to humanitarian staff. Staff may not have the skills required to engage, particularly in the heat of an emergency. Aid workers can, in some cases, be arrogant and distant, as we all have seen so sadly in the many evaluation reports from the response to the Haiti earthquake. Short-term assignments of staff do not enable them to interact and develop relationships with those affected by crisis. The best relationships are made before an emergency strikes. And thirdly, there are a set of constraints related to humanitarian structures and procedures. The first one is projectization, where there can be a tendency to put technical solutions in place rather than making more fundamental changes to organisational culture and behaviour. The next one is an equally ugly word, proceduralisation. And this concerns the trend to more centrally managed organisations and standardised operations, which reduces the agency of staff on the ground and makes them less able to act on the opinions and priorities of the local communities. And as mentioned earlier, measurement and reporting are difficult, and it can be hard to measure the effects of engagement, and this in turn can make it harder to demonstrate the value of engagement approaches and so build support for them. And finally, a supply-led paradigm also inhibits engagement. In other words, the current structure of the humanitarian system, top-down and supply-driven, does not create incentives for engaging with crisis-affected people. So there's not much point in asking what people want if it's already decided what they're going to get. Right, now I realise there's been a lot to take in, so let me just quickly summarise. So the system has consciously been trying to engage with aid recipients for over 30 years, and evaluative material suggests that progress has been slow. The methods by which engagement have taken place, according to the objectives on our power spectrum, show that the aims range from the simple provision of information to a significant transfer of power. And of importance here is the fact that many agencies still appear to be unclear about precisely why they want to engage and what they want to achieve. And this, of course, has not been helped by the interchangeability of terminology. We then looked at the reasons for engagement and the factors that both inhibit and promote engagement, and perhaps the salient point here is that in spite of lack of clarity around motives, definitions, and lack of quality of good evidence, numerous studies do nevertheless suggest that there's much more that humanitarian agencies can do. So you remember that at the beginning of this, I talked about my own experience from Coram all those years ago, and then asked myself the question, and you, what has actually changed since then? Well, I would think that if I was in that air-conditioned Land Cruiser today, I'm pretty sure that the high-level delegation will be fully aware that crisis-affected people had skills and capacities. I think there would also be expectations that international agencies had made efforts to understand local priorities and views, and that they would implement programs that at the very least attempted to be accountable to local people. So I'm pretty sure in my own mind that there has been a paradigm shift in terms of culture and expectations, both in the aid community and indeed in many crisis-affected populations themselves. But, and here's the but, I'm less sure that this shift in culture, desirable as it is, has brought about substantially better outcomes. We may have addressed the why measures, but the how questions that Nan alluded to earlier are still not fully answered. And that leads me on to several key questions, which I hope will get us thinking about how to improve engagement and really improve response. And so I'll finish with these questions. So some of these key questions that we may want to address include the following. What type of engagement do we want to achieve and why? How do we deal with issues of power and politics? Does an engagement agenda mean becoming more developmental? To what degree are common standards and approaches to engagement useful? How do different cultures and languages of various stakeholders affect approaches to engaging crisis-affected people? What are examples of success? How much can be transferred from one context to another? And how do we know what works? How can we harness change in our environment to improve engagement? What changes are needed in the humanitarian system to enable more effective engagement? What can we learn from development actors? And what are the relative roles of the state and NGOs in ensuring engagement? So, that brings me to the end of this presentation. I hope it sets up our discussions nicely, and I will now indulge myself by sitting back and listening to what our panellists think. Thank you very much.